News Channel 5 Network. This is Urban Outlook.
Hello and welcome to Urban Outlook. I'm April Eaton. Thank you so much for being with us today. You know, I know you've seen it, the different areas of Nashville that are under construction, new homes going up wherever you turn the corner. It's looking a little different than it used to look in the past. But some wonder if the changes are happening at the price of the people who have a history of living in many of these neighborhoods. Are families who have spent long years in areas being forced to move out, or are they wanting to move to a different place because the opportunity to sell their home is a great one? What's happening? Is history repeating itself? Well, we thought we'd have a great conversation about this topic, and especially about gentrification. And Dr. Anthony Campbell, who is an assistant professor of the College of Public Services for Tennessee State University, has done extensive research on this topic, particularly in Nashville. So welcome so much. Welcome to our show. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me.
As I said, the face of Nashville has certainly changed in more ways than one through the years, and we have seen the growth and development throughout many of our neighborhoods. What are you seeing? Let's start off with what you're seeing and the changes that you see from your perspective.
Yeah, so I think what we're seeing in so many ways is we're finding that gentrification is kind of this multi-dimensional issue, right? And we're really seeing that play out in Nashville, is that there's no universal definition of what constitutes gentrification. We know it's both there's the physical aspects of it, the displacement, the housing stock changes, but there's also this cultural aspect of it that we're seeing a lot today, right? And I think that's what we're seeing in Nashville, is the variety of gentrification that can occur. So up front, you know, gentrification doesn't have to be bad, right? There's a lot of economic leaders and city leaders around the country who are trying to create the economic conditions to create gentrification.
And historically, though, it's bad.
Historically, it's certainly bad, right? But I think what we have to keep in mind is, in one way, gentrification is about how we improve housing stock in a part of a city, right?
Yeah.
But it never stops there, right? It never stops at that point. And the problem with gentrification, exactly what we're seeing in Nashville, is when you don't include the people who are living there, right? They're not going to benefit from that, right? The housing stock's going to change, the retail offerings are going to change, maybe the economic conditions in that neighborhood or area will change, but the people who have historically lived there rarely benefit, right? Or it's a de minimis benefit with, they flip their house and make some money, but now where do you live?
Right. And that is the difficult thing, because we see this happening in, you know, street after street after street, where you've got these beautiful brand new 3-4 story structures, and then you've got the original house right next door, and then another 3-story structure. So it's almost as though there's pressure to do something, and what that something is, I guess, depends on what that family situation is. Is that what you're seeing?
Most certainly that's what we're seeing, right? And this goes to, why do people leave, right? That's such a big question. How do people succumb to those pressures of gentrification, right? Yeah. And we see up front, people very quickly will get priced out of a neighborhood, right? If you're a renter, or maybe your housing stock's a little lower, then you're going to have to go very quickly. The issue that happens over time that's a little more nefarious is when people begin to be culturally pushed out of an area, right? So now you're surrounded by tall and skinny homes. It's no longer the restaurants or retail stores that has made that your home for maybe multiple generations, and you now feel not as though you're at home in that neighborhood anymore. And that's the cultural aspect of gentrification that I think gets a little too overlooked, but we see happening over and again here in Nashville. I see it with my students who talk about the pressure, the harassment they have to endure, they and their families in parts of North Nashville, where it's a continuous onslaught of not just sell your home to make some money, but you're not welcome here anymore, right? And it's that cultural push that we must be most alarmed about. We have institutions that have the potential to address the economic ramifications of it. It's that cultural dimension of gentrification that's most alarming and most unacceptable.
And is the cultural push, in your opinion, driven by the fact that people don't feel comfortable in their own neighborhoods anymore because they've changed so much, or are they being hounded to move and do something different?
Yeah, I think it's a little of both, right? I think it's certainly that harassment, but I think what's more systemic and kind of goes back to urban renewal in the mid-20th century, and certainly we see again with gentrification, is it really is that absence of a place, right? And I think that's really what a lot of my research focuses on, and the researchers who I respect a lot, is that difference between space and place, right? Space is a physical thing in the world, right? This studio is a space. Place is all of the emotion, the history, the culture that is present in that place, right, in that space rather. And I think that's what we see with that cultural push, is we're seeing not only the displacement of people, we're seeing the displacement of history or eradication of history in some of these parts of the city. And as we know, home means a lot, right? I mean, a house is not a home. They're not the same thing, right? And when you begin to no longer feel at home in your community, maybe where you've lived for multiple generations, then your propensity to entertain ideas to move increases, right? Well, maybe I should just go ahead and move somewhere else, right? But that's a great risk on many levels, including politically, right? Because we have the potential to lose voices, right? Concentrated voices in a neighborhood who have maybe orchestrated change, orchestrated positive change in Nashville for many generations, and now they are pushed out. Now they are divided between different neighborhoods in the city. So it's a little of both.
Yeah, it's interesting because you talk about the push, and sometimes the push is on purpose, right? I grew up in Washington, D.C., and my parents purposely decided when the neighborhood started to change in an area in a way that they weren't interested in being involved in more violence in the neighborhood, that we wanted to move out to the suburbs, they used to call it, right? So we gave up our little row house for a better life, is how my mom and dad put it, and it turned into a better life for us. So it was on purpose to leave. Now we go back and that whole area looks completely different than it did when I grew up. So sometimes people leave for those very personal reasons, right? But I guess your research and the important thing that you want to make sure is that we don't lose the cultural aspect when folks and families make decisions.
Yes, and I think that loss of culture, right? We can sometimes take culture for granted today, right? Especially when we have so many economic conditions that are kind of pushing in on an area or a neighborhood, right? And I think, there's many wonderful stories where families such as yours kind of took that cue and I don't like what's happening here, I'm going to move on, right? But as we know, unfortunately, there's many stories where they end up kind of dispersed. They end up as part of this kind of urban diaspora, right? They never make it back together. Families are broken apart. And I think, as you said, the research that makes me very interested and the research I'm working on is beginning to look at that loss of culture, right? What that begins to mean, because we can't turn the city completely into a marketplace of who can afford the best house, right? Then the city becomes something very different. It becomes whoever has the political power and the economic power to define what is the culture in a neighborhood. And that's a city, but it's not necessarily a city I would want to live in, and I think most people don't want to live in those cities or neighborhoods.
There's been a lot of news lately and articles lately about what's happening in North Nashville in particular, and whether history is repeating itself. Talk a little bit about your perception of what's going on there from your research and otherwise.
Yeah, so I think we see in North Nashville a long history of people of color and people with less political power being displaced, being dispossessed of their history and their culture. It begins, in so many ways with the urban renewal projects from, the early to mid-20th century with the construction of I-40, right? With the construction of I-265, right? And this is a piece of history that repeated itself all over the country, right? Why were those highways constructed there? People of color, people with less economic means, people with less political power, right? So that to begin with was a violent intrusion into where these people lived, into their homes. And then what also happened in North Nashville, similar to other places, was that people began to get a signal to them that the city didn't care, that government didn't care, right? So we saw that at that period of time with urban renewal. We now see it again with gentrification, not as much guided by the government, but guided by economic forces, right, that are beginning to displace people. Government still has a very important role, but we're beginning to see the same cycle occur again with some tipping of the hat to the culture, to the history that was there, right? This is the gateway to the gateway to Heritage Plaza, right? And as Crystal DeGregory at Kentucky State University said, that's lipstick on a pig. We've quite literally put the history of this neighborhood, this important history of these people, underneath an overpass, right? Are we okay with that, right? I mean, yeah, it's nice, but what does that signal? That signals we've literally subordinated them to this interstate that for some reason has had so much importance over time. So I think I certainly agree with the scholars who are saying that we're seeing history repeat itself in that part of Nashville, and it's happening elsewhere. I think that's why we have to be mindful of multicultural collaborations, because it will happen in your neighborhood. It does not matter your skin color. It will come for you. But if we can band together as we have during history, we maybe can hold it off.
Dr. Campbell, let's take a quick break, and when I come back, I also want us to talk about that whole idea of bringing the multicultural group together and how they can start fighting for what they think they want in their neighborhoods. We'll be right back after this.
This is a story.